Evening, sir. License and registration, please.
Large. No need for that.
The patrol car's dashboard camera flickered to life at precisely 10:17 p.m. on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday evening. The timestamp glowed in the corner of the frame, documenting what would become the opening moments of one of the most explosive judicial scandals in American legal history. What began as a completely routine traffic stop along Interstate 42 in Mercer County would eventually expose a criminal network so vast and so deeply embedded within the halls of justice that it would shake the very foundations of an entire state's legal system. The financial consequences alone would exceed anything the county had ever experienced, forcing officials to confront decades of institutional failure that had allowed corruption to flourish unchecked beneath the surface of their community. Deputy Daniel Reeves had been working the overnight patrol shift along this particular stretch of highway for nearly 8 years. He knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every spot where speeders like to accelerate thinking no one was watching. The road curved through a mix of rural farmland and scattered suburban developments, and at this late hour, traffic was sparse enough that any vehicle behaving unusually stood out immediately. Reeves had developed instincts during his years on the road, a sense for when something wasn't quite right, when a vehicle's movement suggested the driver might be impaired or distracted or simply not paying attention to the rules that kept everyone safe. That Thursday night, those instincts kicked in when he noticed a silver luxury sedan drifting slightly across the center line. The vehicle wasn't weaving dramatically, but the subtle movements were enough to catch his attention. It was traveling perhaps 5 miles above the posted limit. Nothing extreme, but combined with the lane drift, it painted a picture worth investigating. Reeves activated his emergency lights and watched as the sedan gradually slowed and pulled onto the gravel shoulder near mile marker 31. The car came to rest beneath the glow of a distant streetlight, its engine still running, brake lights casting a red glow across the dusty roadside. If you find stories about the intersection of power and justice as compelling as I do, consider subscribing to this channel. The revelations in this case only get more disturbing as we go deeper. And trust me, you will not want to miss what comes next. Deputy Reeves approached the vehicle with the careful awareness that 8 years of experience had taught him. Every traffic stop carried unpredictable risks, and he had learned to approach each one with the same level of professional attention, regardless of how routine it might appear. His body camera activated automatically as he stepped out of his cruiser, and that small piece of technology would soon become the most important piece of evidence in a case that would redefine corruption in the American justice system. The driver's side window descended slowly, almost reluctantly, as Reeves approached. The first thing that struck him was the smell. Alcohol emanated from the interior of the vehicle with unmistakable potency. The man behind the wheel was dressed in what appeared to be an expensive charcoal suit, the kind that cost more than most people earned in a month. His silver tie was loosened, his collar unbuttoned, and his eyes had the glassy, unfocused quality that immediately suggested impairment. He appeared to be in his late 50s or early 60s, with gray hair carefully styled and a face that carried the confident expression of someone accustomed to authority and deference. Reeves maintained his professional demeanor as he requested the standard documentation: license, registration, proof of insurance. The driver's movements were slow and deliberate as he reached for his wallet, fumbling slightly with the leather before extracting his identification. He handed the license over without a word, and Reeves angled it toward the light to read the information printed there. The name on the license was Judge Harold Whitmore. Something shifted in Reeves's chest as he processed what he was reading. He recognized that name. Every law enforcement officer in the county recognized that name. Judge Harold Whitmore had presided over the Mercer County Circuit Court for more than 22 years. He was a fixture of the local legal establishment, known throughout the region for his rigid approach to sentencing and his reputation as a no-nonsense arbiter of the law. Reeves himself had testified in Judge Whitmore's courtroom on numerous occasions, watching from the witness stand as the judge handed down sentences that sometimes seemed disproportionately severe. But standing here on the shoulder of Interstate 42, with the smell of alcohol thick in the air and the evidence of impaired driving fresh in his mind, Deputy Reeves understood that Judge Whitmore was currently just a citizen who appeared to be breaking the law. Whatever authority the judge wielded inside his courtroom had no jurisdiction over this roadside encounter. The law was supposed to apply equally to everyone, and Reeves had spent his entire career believing in that principle. He returned to his patrol car to run the license and registration through the system, and what the computer revealed would later prove to be a crucial piece of the puzzle. Judge Whitmore's driving record showed a pattern that should have been impossible for someone with his history. There were 4 previous incidents documented over the past decade, each one involving similar circumstances, and each one had been mysteriously resolved without meaningful consequences. 2 separate driving under the influence charges from different jurisdictions had simply vanished from his record. A reckless endangerment citation had been reduced to a minor equipment violation. An accident report that mentioned suspected intoxication had been amended to remove any reference to alcohol involvement. Someone had been systematically protecting Judge Whitmore from the consequences of his actions. The records told a story of intervention and manipulation of a system that had been bent repeatedly to shield one man from accountability. But tonight, standing on that lonely stretch of highway with his body camera recording every moment, Deputy Reeves represented something that all the connections and influence in the world couldn't easily dismiss. He was an officer doing his job, and he had no intention of becoming part of the cover-up. When Reeves returned to the vehicle, Judge Whitmore's demeanor had shifted noticeably. The initial passive compliance had been replaced by something harder, more calculating. The judge leaned toward the window with an expression that mixed irritation with barely concealed contempt. "Officer," he said, his words carrying the slightly slurred quality of intoxication, "I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I'm Judge Harold Whitmore. I preside over the circuit court. Whatever you think is happening, I can assure you this stop is unnecessary." Reeves maintained his composure, though internally he felt the familiar tension that comes from confronting someone who expects their position to exempt them from accountability. He explained calmly that he had observed erratic driving and detected a strong odor of alcohol. Standard procedure required him to conduct field sobriety tests to determine whether the driver was impaired. The judge's face hardened. "I'm not going to participate in any tests. This is ridiculous. Do you have any idea who I am? Do you have any concept of what I can do to your career?" The threat hung in the air between them, naked and undisguised. Reeves had encountered intimidation before. People often said things they didn't mean when facing potential arrest. But there was something different about the judge's tone, something that suggested this wasn't an empty bluff, but rather a statement of established fact. Judge Whitmore spoke like a man who had made similar threats before and watched them come true. "Your Honor," Reeves replied, keeping his voice level and professional, "I understand your position, but I'm required by law to follow proper procedure. Refusing the sobriety test will result in automatic license suspension and arrest for suspected driving under the influence. What happened next would become the most damaging evidence in the entire investigation." Judge Whitmore, apparently convinced that his connections could still rescue him from the situation, pulled out his cell phone and began making calls. His body camera captured every word, every name, every incriminating detail. The first call went to someone the judge addressed as Frank. The conversation quickly revealed that Frank was the county sheriff, Franklin Morrison. Judge Whitmore spoke to him with the easy familiarity of longtime associates, demanding that he intervene immediately. "I need you to handle this," the judge said, his words slurring slightly. "One of your deputies has made a serious mistake, and I need it corrected right now." When that call failed to produce the immediate rescue the judge expected, he tried another number. This time, he left a voicemail for someone at the district attorney's office, speaking in clipped tones about favors owed and expectations unmet. The message contained references to specific cases, specific defendants, specific arrangements that had been made in the past. Every word was captured in perfect clarity by the body camera that the judge seemed to have forgotten was there. The third call was perhaps the most alarming. Judge Whitmore spoke to someone he referred to only as his contact in the Capitol, making statements about a network of mutual protection, about officials who understood how things worked, about consequences for anyone who disrupted the arrangements that kept everyone safe and prosperous. Deputy Reeves stood silently during these calls, his professional training keeping him outwardly calm, while internally he processed the staggering implications of what he was witnessing. The judge wasn't just asking for a favor. He was activating what appeared to be an entire system of corruption, a web of connections that existed specifically to shield powerful people from the legal consequences that ordinary citizens faced every day. I want to pause here and ask you something directly. What would you do in Deputy Reeves's position? You're standing on a dark highway, confronting one of the most powerful figures in your county's justice system, watching him call in favors from people who could destroy your career with a single phone call. Would you have the courage to proceed? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Reeves called for backup and requested a supervisor to respond to the scene. Whatever was about to happen, he wanted witnesses and documentation. He wanted everything handled exactly by the book, with no procedural gaps that could later be exploited to dismiss the case. The first backup unit arrived within 15 minutes. Deputy Christina Vasquez had been patrolling a nearby sector and responded immediately to Reeves's request. Her own body camera began recording as she approached the scene, capturing Judge Whitmore's reaction to the arrival of a second officer. The judge's strategy shifted dramatically when he realized that his phone calls weren't producing immediate results. What happened next was so brazen, so transparently corrupt, that prosecutors would later describe it as the moment Judge Whitmore sealed his own fate. He began offering bribes directly. First, he suggested to Deputy Reeves that perhaps they could reach an understanding. He mentioned that officers who showed appropriate discretion in delicate matters often found their testimony received very favorably in his courtroom. Cases they brought before him had a way of resulting in convictions, while officers who made trouble sometimes discovered that their cases were dismissed on technical grounds. When this veiled approach didn't produce the desired response, the judge escalated. He talked about career opportunities, about promotions, about how people who understood the way things really worked tended to advance much faster than those who insisted on following every rule to the letter. Finally, with both officers standing firm in their refusal to be corrupted, Judge Whitmore reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope. He opened it to reveal what appeared to be several $1,000s in cash. His words were captured clearly by both body cameras. "This is nothing," he said, his voice carrying both desperation and arrogance. "This is just a gesture of goodwill. You let me make a phone call, get someone to drive me home, and we forget this ever happened. There's much more available for officers who understand how the system actually functions." Both deputies refused. Reeves informed Judge Whitmore that he was under arrest for driving under the influence, attempted bribery of law enforcement officers, and official misconduct. The words seemed to hit the judge like physical blows. For perhaps the first time in decades, he was confronting a situation that his power and connections couldn't immediately dissolve. As Reeves placed the handcuffs on Judge Whitmore's wrists, the judge made what would prove to be his most catastrophic mistake. Faced with the reality of arrest, his composure cracked completely. He began talking rapidly, almost compulsively, about the system he had helped build and the people who were part of it. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said, his voice rising with a mixture of anger and panic. "I'm not alone in this. There are judges in 4 different counties who work the same way I do. There are prosecutors, police chiefs, state representatives. We protect each other. We've been protecting each other for years. You think arresting me is going to change anything? They'll come for you. They'll destroy your career, your reputation, everything you care about." The threats continued as they transported him to the county detention center. Sitting in the back of the patrol car, Judge Whitmore made call after call on his cell phone, which the officers had allowed him to retain temporarily as a matter of documentation. Each conversation revealed more details about the corrupt network he had referenced. He named names. He discussed specific cases. He talked about payments received and favors exchanged with the casual familiarity of someone who had been operating this way for so long that he no longer recognized the criminality of his own behavior. Every word was recorded. At the county jail, Judge Whitmore's behavior became even more erratic. During the booking process, he continued attempting to bribe anyone who came near him. He offered to dismiss pending cases for family members of jail staff. He promised favorable rulings for officers with matters coming before his court. He suggested that inmates currently being held on charges in his jurisdiction might find their situations improved if only the people processing his arrest would show appropriate flexibility. The breathalyzer test registered his blood alcohol content at nearly double the legal limit. Combined with his refusal to submit to field sobriety testing, his multiple documented attempts at bribery, and his explicit threats against the arresting officers, the case against him appeared insurmountable. But this was only the beginning. Word of Judge Whitmore's arrest spread through the Mercer County legal community like wildfire. By morning, the courthouse was buzzing with speculation and anxiety. Attorneys who had practiced before the judge for years exchanged worried glances in the hallways. Prosecutors huddled in closed-door meetings. Court staff spoke in hushed voices about what the arrest might mean for pending cases and past convictions. Within 48 hours, the state attorney general's office announced that it was taking over the investigation. The scope of what Deputy Reeves had uncovered demanded resources and independence that local authorities couldn't provide. Federal investigators from the FBI were called in when it became clear that the corruption extended across state lines and potentially involved violations of federal racketeering statutes. The investigation team that descended on Mercer County transformed the courthouse into something resembling a command center from a federal crime drama. They converted an unused conference room into their base of operations, filling it with evidence boxes, computer terminals, and large whiteboards covered with names, connections, and financial flows. Dozens of investigators worked around the clock, unraveling what would eventually be documented as one of the largest judicial corruption conspiracies in American legal history. Deputy Reeves found himself at the center of everything. His body camera footage from that Thursday night became the cornerstone of the entire investigation. Federal prosecutors described it as the most comprehensive real-time documentation of judicial corruption they had ever encountered. Every bribe attempt, every threat, every incriminating phone call had been captured in perfect audio and visual clarity. The footage would eventually be shown in courtrooms across the country as evidence of how deeply corruption could embed itself within the institutions designed to deliver justice. The first wave of additional arrests came within 3 weeks of Judge Whitmore's detention. Sheriff Franklin Morrison, who had received that late-night phone call from the judge, was charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Analysis of his phone records revealed that immediately after speaking with Whitmore, he had contacted 4 other officials to warn them about the situation and coordinate a response. The calls demonstrated a coordinated effort to contain the damage and protect the network that Whitmore had referenced during his arrest. The district attorney's office underwent complete upheaval as investigators discovered that the voicemail Whitmore left that night was far from his first communication with prosecutors about fixing cases. Email records stretching back more than 6 years revealed systematic coordination between the judge and senior members of the prosecutorial staff. Specific defendants had been flagged for special treatment. Charges had been modified based on financial arrangements. Justice had been bought and sold with the casual efficiency of any other business transaction. As investigators dug deeper into court records, they discovered patterns that defied innocent explanation. Defendants represented by certain law firms consistently received sentences far lighter than comparable cases. Wealthy individuals with no prior criminal history somehow avoided prison time for serious felonies that would have sent ordinary citizens away for years. Meanwhile, first-time offenders from poor communities received maximum sentences for relatively minor infractions. One case particularly horrified the investigators examining the records. A prominent real estate developer had been involved in a drunk driving accident that killed a young couple and their infant daughter. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses had seen him drinking heavily at a business dinner shortly before the crash. His blood alcohol level at the scene was more than 3 times the legal limit. The victims' families had expected justice, had believed that the system would hold the man accountable for destroying their loved ones. Instead, Judge Whitmore had accepted a plea arrangement that resulted in just 14 months in a minimum security facility and a fine that amounted to less than the developer spent on his annual country club membership. The families had never understood how such a light sentence was possible. They had spent years believing that the system had simply failed them through some inexplicable breakdown. Now they learned the truth. Financial records showed that substantial payments had been made to ensure that lenient outcome. The developer had essentially purchased his way out of meaningful accountability for taking 3 innocent lives. The family members of the victims, when shown the evidence by investigators, experienced a devastation that was in some ways worse than their original grief. At least before, they could believe that justice had simply failed. Now they knew it had been deliberately stolen from them. The forensic accountants assigned to the case discovered that Judge Whitmore's corruption extended far beyond individual bribes for favorable rulings. He had been operating what essentially amounted to a criminal enterprise from his position on the bench. His salary as a circuit court judge was approximately $165,000 annually, a comfortable living by any reasonable measure. But investigators found evidence of annual expenditures exceeding $2.5 million. Luxury vehicles appeared in his name. Real estate investments accumulated in his portfolio. Expensive vacations, jewelry, artwork, and collectibles filled his home, all of it funded by the systematic sale of justice to those who could afford to pay. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of Judge Whitmore's personal documentation of his crimes. Apparently convinced that his position made him untouchable, he had kept meticulous records of his illegal activities. Investigators found notebooks listing defendants, the amounts paid for favorable treatment, and detailed notes about the expectations of those who had purchased his services. He had essentially created a pricing guide for corruption, with murder and serious violent crimes commanding the highest rates, followed by major financial offenses, while drug charges and property crimes had standardized fees that reflected their relative frequency. The scale of the conspiracy became clearer as more officials were arrested and began cooperating with investigators in hopes of reducing their own exposure. The network that Judge Whitmore had referenced during his arrest proved even more extensive than his panicked claims had suggested. Similar corruption schemes were operating in 4 neighboring counties, all connected through a system of mutual protection and shared profits that had evolved over more than 15 years. Think about that for a moment. For 15 years, justice in this region had been systematically corrupted. Thousands of cases had been influenced by payments rather than evidence. Countless defendants had received sentences determined by their wealth rather than their crimes. And throughout all of it, the officials responsible had protected each other, silencing anyone who threatened to expose the truth. If this story is making you think differently about how our justice system actually works, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. We cover cases like this regularly, exposing the hidden systems of corruption and abuse of power that affect ordinary people's lives. The ripple effects of the investigation spread throughout the legal community. Attorneys came forward with their own experiences, some admitting their participation in the corruption and seeking reduced consequences through cooperation. Others revealing how they had been threatened or pressured to participate against their will. Several lawyers described being told explicitly that their clients would face harsher sentences if they refused to play along with the judge's demands. Public defenders were particularly affected by these revelations. Many of their clients, the people too poor to afford private attorneys, had received disproportionately harsh sentences. These weren't the big money cases that Judge Whitmore was primarily interested in. Instead, they served a different purpose. By maintaining a reputation for severe sentencing in ordinary cases, the judge created the illusion of judicial toughness that helped conceal his willingness to be lenient when properly compensated. Families who had watched their loved ones disappear into the prison system for years, who had written letters and filed appeals and begged for mercy, suddenly understood why none of it had made any difference. Their pleas had fallen on ears that weren't just deaf, but actively corrupted. The judge who sentenced their family members had never cared about rehabilitation or public safety or justice. He cared about money and power and protecting his position within the corrupt network he had helped build. The psychological impact on Deputy Reeves was significant, though he rarely spoke about it publicly. He had testified in Judge Whitmore's courtroom dozens of times over the years. He had watched the judge hand down sentences that sometimes seemed excessive, that sometimes made him uncomfortable, even as he accepted them as the outcome of legitimate legal proceedings. Now he understood that those harsh sentences served a specific purpose within the corruption scheme. They maintained the judge's reputation for toughness, providing cover for the cases where money changed hands and outcomes were predetermined. How many innocent people had Reeves helped send to prison through his testimony in that courtroom? How many families had been destroyed by sentences that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with maintaining a corrupt judge's public image? These questions haunted him during sleepless nights, even as he was publicly praised for his role in exposing the scandal. Media attention intensified as more details emerged. Television news crews established semi-permanent positions outside the courthouse, interviewing anyone willing to speak about their experiences with Judge Whitmore and the corrupt system he had operated. Documentary film crews began developing projects about the scandal. Book publishers approached key figures with offers for their exclusive stories. The case had captured national attention as an example of how deeply corruption could penetrate the institutions that citizens depended on for justice. Former defendants and their families shared their stories in growing numbers. They described sentences that had never made sense, of watching wealthy defendants walk free while they or their loved ones faced years of incarceration for lesser offenses. They talked about the frustration and despair of believing the system had simply failed them, and the complicated mix of validation and rage that came from learning the truth. At least now they understood why. But that understanding brought its own form of trauma. The State Bar Association launched investigations into every attorney who had practiced before Judge Whitmore's court during his tenure. They needed to determine who had been victimized by the corruption and who had been complicit. Several prominent law firms found themselves under intense scrutiny as investigators traced financial connections between legal fees and judicial outcomes. Some attorneys faced criminal charges for their direct participation in bribery schemes. Others lost their licenses for failing to report corruption they had witnessed. Still others emerged as victims themselves, professionals who had tried to practice law ethically while working within a system that was fundamentally compromised. Local politicians faced intense pressure to explain how such extensive corruption had gone undetected for more than 2 decades. County commissioners, city council members, and state legislators all claimed ignorance. But investigators found evidence that warnings had been issued over the years. Complaints had been filed about Judge Whitmore's behavior. Whistleblowers had tried to raise alarms. In every case, the complaints had been dismissed, the warnings ignored, the whistleblowers silenced or discredited. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a letter sent to the State Judicial Oversight Board nearly 8 years before Judge Whitmore's arrest. A court clerk, troubled by patterns she had observed in the judge's rulings, had documented specific cases where sentences seemed to correlate with payments she suspected had been made. The board had conducted what they described as a thorough review and found no evidence of misconduct. The clerk was subsequently transferred to a different position, and her concerns were buried in an administrative file that investigators discovered only through persistent searching. The jail where Judge Whitmore was being held became its own focal point of public attention. Other inmates, many of whom had appeared before him in his courtroom, recognized the profound irony of their former judge now wearing the same orange jumpsuit they had worn when he sentenced them. Stories leaked out about the judge's difficulty adjusting to incarceration, about his complaints regarding the conditions, about his apparent shock at being treated like any other prisoner. He reportedly asked for special accommodations, for a private cell, for better food, for access to reading materials befitting his intellectual status. Each request was denied. For the first time in decades, Judge Harold Whitmore was experiencing what it felt like to have no power, no influence, no ability to bend the system to his will. As the investigation expanded, federal prosecutors began building what they described as an insurmountable case. They had the recordings from Deputy Reeves's body camera, providing real-time documentation of attempted bribery and explicit discussion of the corrupt network. They had financial records demonstrating systematic payments that correlated with judicial outcomes. They had witness testimony from dozens of cooperating defendants who had participated in or observed the corruption. And they had Judge Whitmore's own notebooks, essentially a written confession of years of criminal activity. The scope of the civil lawsuits filed in the wake of these revelations was staggering. Hundreds of former defendants and their families retained attorneys to sue not just Judge Whitmore personally, but the entire county system that had allowed his corruption to flourish for so long. The potential financial liability was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, threatening to bankrupt the county government entirely. Insurance companies that provided coverage for the county's legal liabilities launched their own investigations, trying to determine whether the systematic nature of the corruption voided their policy obligations. They argued that coverage was designed for negligence and errors, not for intentional criminal enterprises operated by government officials. The insurance litigation added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Deputy Reeves continued his regular patrol duties throughout the investigation, but his life had changed in fundamental ways. He received death threats from people connected to Judge Whitmore's network, requiring additional security measures for himself and his family. At the same time, he was being celebrated as a hero by reform advocates and ordinary citizens who saw him as the honest officer who had finally exposed a system of corruption that many had suspected, but no one had been able to prove. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had simply been doing his job that Thursday night. He hadn't set out to become a whistleblower or a reformer. He had just been unwilling to compromise his integrity, even when confronted with threats and bribes from one of the most powerful figures in his county. That simple commitment to doing his job properly had set in motion a cascade of consequences that no one could have predicted. The federal investigation revealed connections that extended far beyond Mercer County and even beyond the neighboring jurisdictions initially implicated. Judge Whitmore's network had developed relationships with corrupt officials in 3 other states. Digital forensics teams analyzing thousands of emails and text messages discovered encrypted communications discussing the transfer of high-profile defendants to courts where outcomes could be guaranteed for the right price. What had started as local corruption had evolved into an interstate criminal enterprise. Private prison corporations emerged as significant players in the scandal as investigators followed the money trails. Judge Whitmore had been receiving regular payments from correctional companies in exchange for ensuring high occupancy rates at their facilities. His harsh sentences in cases involving defendants who couldn't afford to buy leniency served a dual purpose. They maintained his reputation for toughness while generating profits for the private prison industry that had essentially purchased his services. One case that particularly illustrated this arrangement involved a young man named Antonio Reyes, a 21-year-old community college student who had been arrested for possession of a small amount of marijuana. It was his first offense. He had no violent history. He was weeks away from completing his associate's degree and had been accepted to transfer to a 4-year university. Judge Whitmore sentenced him to 12 years in state prison. The sentence was so disproportionate that Antonio's family had spent years trying to understand what had happened. They hired attorneys to file appeals. They wrote letters to anyone who might listen. They never received a satisfactory explanation for why their son, a first-time offender with a promising future, had received a sentence more appropriate for a violent career criminal. Investigators discovered that Judge Whitmore had received a substantial payment from a private prison operator just days before Antonio's sentencing. The company needed to maintain minimum occupancy levels to satisfy their contract with the state, and Judge Whitmore had been helping them meet those quotas by sending young people like Antonio into the prison system for unconscionably long sentences. Antonio had already served 5 years of his sentence when the corruption was exposed. He was released within weeks of the investigation becoming public, but those 5 years could never be returned to him. The education he had been pursuing was interrupted. The opportunities he had been building toward had dissolved. His life had been permanently altered by a system that viewed him not as a human being deserving of justice, but as a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. The financial audit of Judge Whitmore's personal assets painted a picture of a man who had built an entire lifestyle on corruption. His official residence was a sprawling estate in the most exclusive part of the county, a property worth nearly 10 times what he could have legitimately afforded on his judicial salary. He owned multiple luxury vehicles, including collectible cars that rarely left his climate-controlled garage. His investment portfolio contained holdings that had grown far beyond what his legitimate income could have funded. Forensic accountants traced money flows that resembled organized crime operations more than judicial misconduct. Judge Whitmore had been laundering his bribery payments through a sophisticated network of shell companies, consulting agreements, and real estate transactions. The complexity of the money laundering operation suggested he had professional assistance from financial advisors who were now facing their own criminal charges. A psychological evaluation ordered by federal prosecutors revealed disturbing insights into Judge Whitmore's mindset. He genuinely believed that his position entitled him to operate above the law. He viewed bribery not as corruption, but as appropriate compensation for his valuable services. He had developed such an extreme sense of grandiosity that he considered himself immune from the consequences that applied to ordinary people. The irony of a judge who had sent countless defendants to prison, believing that he himself was above prosecution, seemed lost on him even as he faced his own criminal charges. Victims of Judge Whitmore's corruption began organizing support groups to process their trauma. Learning that their sentences had been influenced by corruption rather than justice brought a complicated mix of emotions. There was validation in finally understanding why things had happened the way they did. There was rage at the systematic injustice they had experienced, and there was grief for the time lost, the opportunities destroyed, the families torn apart by a system that had never cared about doing what was right. The media coverage continued intensifying as investigative journalists uncovered additional layers of the conspiracy. What had started as a story about one corrupt judge became a broader examination of systemic failures in judicial oversight, campaign finance, and the intersection of money and power in the American legal system. Documentary filmmakers and book authors began developing projects that would eventually bring this story to national and international audiences. County officials scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, but the financial implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Bond rating agencies downgraded the county's credit rating, making it more expensive to borrow money for essential services. Property values in the region began declining as potential residents and businesses reconsidered whether they wanted to establish themselves in a place associated with such pervasive corruption. The economic consequences of the scandal extended far beyond the direct costs of settlements and investigations. The state Supreme Court took the unprecedented step of ordering a comprehensive review of every case decided by Judge Whitmore during his 22 years on the bench. They appointed special masters to examine thousands of verdicts, sentences, and judicial decisions to determine which had been influenced by corruption. The review process was expected to take years and cost millions of dollars. Defense attorneys throughout the state began filing appeals for clients who had been sentenced by Judge Whitmore, arguing that systematic corruption invalidated their convictions entirely. Prosecutors found themselves in an impossible position. They were being asked to defend verdicts that may have been purchased rather than earned through legitimate legal proceedings. Cases they had believed represented justice now looked like potential miscarriages that they had unwittingly facilitated. The moral complexity of their situation weighed heavily on many of them. The federal investigation expanded to examine how Judge Whitmore had been elevated to the bench in the first place, and whether the same systemic problems existed in other judicial appointments. They discovered that political connections and financial contributions had played inappropriately significant roles in the selection process. The oversight mechanisms that should have detected warning signs had been either inadequate or deliberately circumvented. Legislative hearings were scheduled to examine the failures that had allowed this corruption to flourish for so long. State lawmakers faced pressure to implement comprehensive reforms, including new transparency requirements, enhanced financial disclosure for judicial officials, and independent oversight mechanisms with real authority to investigate complaints. The scandal had created a moment of potential transformation, an opportunity to address systemic problems that had been allowed to fester for decades. Deputy Reeves continued to receive security protection due to the serious threats against him and his family. The investigation had revealed connections between Judge Whitmore's network and organized crime figures who had benefited from his corrupt rulings. These were not people who would simply accept the destruction of their profitable arrangements without seeking some form of retaliation. The officers assigned to protect Reeves took the threats extremely seriously. The first major settlement negotiations began as county officials confronted the staggering financial exposure they faced. Insurance companies were refusing to cover claims arising from intentional criminal conduct, leaving taxpayers potentially responsible for hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. Attorneys representing victims argued that every person who had appeared before Judge Whitmore over his entire career deserved compensation for the tainted process they had experienced. The preliminary settlement discussions took place behind closed doors in the federal courthouse, with experienced mediators attempting to place a dollar value on decades of systematic injustice. How do you calculate damages for years of wrongful imprisonment? How do you compensate families for the destruction of their loved ones' lives and futures? How do you quantify the psychological trauma of learning that the system you trusted to deliver justice was actually selling it to the highest bidder? The breakthrough came when Judge Whitmore's defense team approached federal prosecutors about a cooperation agreement. Facing the possibility of multiple life sentences under federal racketeering statutes, the disgraced judge finally seemed to understand that his position could no longer protect him from consequences. His attorneys indicated that he was willing to provide detailed information about the broader corruption network in exchange for reduced charges. Federal prosecutors were initially skeptical. Judge Whitmore had demonstrated a consistent willingness to lie and manipulate throughout the investigation. He had attempted to minimize his role and shift blame to others at every opportunity. But the information he offered proved too valuable to reject. He provided details about corruption schemes in 5 other states, naming judges, prosecutors, and political officials who had participated in similar pay-for-justice operations. The cooperation agreement required Judge Whitmore to submit to extensive debriefing sessions lasting hundreds of hours. He was required to surrender all hidden assets, provide complete financial records, and testify against his former co-conspirators in trials that would stretch over the coming years. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to recommend a 30-year federal prison sentence instead of the multiple life terms he originally faced. He would also be required to forfeit every asset that had been purchased with corruption proceeds, stripping away the lavish lifestyle he had built through decades of criminal activity. Meanwhile, the civil settlement negotiations were reaching figures that stunned even experienced legal observers. County officials received preliminary damage estimates exceeding $475 million, representing compensation for the countless people victimized by Judge Whitmore's corrupt practices over his career. The county's entire annual budget was less than $75 million, making it mathematically impossible to pay such settlements without extraordinary measures. Emergency meetings with state and federal officials explored options including special federal funding, state assistance programs, and potential bankruptcy protection for the county government. The taxpayers of Mercer County were facing the prospect of paying for decades of corruption that many of them had known nothing about, funding settlements for crimes committed by officials they had trusted to uphold the law. The first individual settlements were announced for victims who had suffered the most egregious treatment under Judge Whitmore's corrupt regime. Antonio Reyes, the college student sentenced to 12 years for minor marijuana possession, received a settlement of $14 million plus immediate expungement of his conviction. His family's attorney described the payment as acknowledgement that no amount of money could restore the 5 years of his life stolen by corruption, but that the settlement at least provided resources for him to rebuild the future that had been taken from him. Similar settlements were announced for dozens of other victims whose cases demonstrated clear evidence of corrupt influence. Families who had lost loved ones in accidents caused by wealthy defendants who bought their way to light sentences received substantial compensation. Young people who had been sent to prison for minor offenses to satisfy private prison quotas were freed and compensated. The full scope of restitution would take years to complete, but the process had finally begun. Private prison companies faced their own legal and financial consequences as the investigation documented their participation in the corruption scheme. Congressional hearings examined how profit motives had corrupted the justice system, with lawmakers demanding explanations for contracts that essentially paid judges to keep facilities occupied. Stock prices for correctional corporations plummeted as investors recognized the financial exposure from participating in activities that were now being prosecuted as criminal enterprises. The ripple effects extended throughout the legal profession as bar associations across multiple states launched investigations into attorneys who had practiced before corrupt judges. Some lawyers faced criminal charges for their direct participation in bribery schemes. Others lost their professional licenses for failing to report corruption they had witnessed. Law schools across the country began revising their ethics curricula to address the systematic failures revealed by this investigation, recognizing that traditional approaches to legal ethics had proven inadequate to prevent or detect this kind of institutional corruption. Victims' families organized advocacy groups that pushed for reforms extending far beyond Mercer County. They demanded mandatory recording of all judicial proceedings, not just trials, but also plea negotiations and sentencing hearings. They called for independent oversight of judicial conduct with real investigative authority and the power to refer findings for prosecution. They advocated for automatic review processes that would flag unusual sentencing patterns for scrutiny. Their efforts gained national attention as politicians recognized that the problems exposed in this case likely existed in other jurisdictions as well. Let me ask you this directly. After hearing everything that happened in this case, do you believe justice was ultimately served? The guilty were punished and the victims were compensated, but can any amount of money or prison time truly make up for what was done? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe more people need to hear stories like this, please subscribe and share this video. The legal proceedings stretched over more than 3 years as the various criminal cases worked their way through the courts. Judge Whitmore ultimately received his 30-year federal sentence, emerging from the courtroom in handcuffs to face the cameras of the assembled media. He made no statement, showed no emotion, and gave no indication of remorse for the thousands of lives his corruption had damaged or destroyed. Forensic accountants documented that he had received more than $55 million in corrupt payments over his career, all of which he was now required to forfeit. Sheriff Morrison received 18 years for his role in the conspiracy, having been convicted of obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and multiple counts of corruption. Several senior prosecutors from the district attorney's office received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. Lower-level participants in the network received various terms depending on their cooperation and the severity of their involvement. In total, more than 40 officials across 5 counties were convicted of charges related to the corruption scheme that Judge Whitmore had helped organize and maintain. The civil settlements ultimately reached a staggering total of $725 million, far exceeding the initial estimates and requiring a combination of federal disaster relief funding, state emergency appropriations, and long-term county bond issues to satisfy. The financial burden would affect Mercer County for decades to come, a lasting reminder of the cost of allowing corruption to flourish unchecked within public institutions. Deputy Daniel Reeves was promoted to detective and later to sergeant, recognition of both his integrity during the initial traffic stop and his invaluable cooperation with investigators throughout the case. He remained uncomfortable with the hero designation that others attached to him, consistently maintaining that he had simply done his job and followed proper procedures. But his example became a teaching case at law enforcement academies, demonstrating how one officer's commitment to doing the right thing could expose and ultimately destroy an entire network of institutional corruption. The reforms that emerged from the scandal fundamentally transformed how the state approached judicial oversight. New transparency requirements forced disclosure of financial information that had previously been hidden. Independent oversight bodies with real investigative authority replaced the compliant review boards that had dismissed previous complaints about Judge Whitmore. Automatic review systems were implemented to flag unusual sentencing patterns for scrutiny. These changes couldn't undo the damage that had already been done, but they represented a genuine effort to prevent similar corruption from developing in the future. Perhaps most importantly, the case changed how many ordinary citizens thought about the justice system. The comfortable assumption that courts operated fairly and impartially had been shattered by the revelations of systematic corruption. People who had never questioned judicial authority now understood that judges were human beings capable of the same greed and moral failure as anyone else. That loss of innocence was painful, but it also created public demand for accountability that made meaningful reform possible. The story of Deputy Daniel Reeves and Judge Harold Whitmore stands as both a warning and an inspiration. It warns us that corruption can embed itself deeply within the institutions we trust to deliver justice, protected by networks of mutual benefit that make exposure difficult and dangerous. but it also inspires us with the example of what one person can accomplish by simply refusing to compromise their integrity, even when confronted by power that seems overwhelming. On that Thursday night along Interstate 42, Deputy Reeves couldn't have known that his routine traffic stop would expose one of the largest judicial corruption scandals in American history. He couldn't have predicted the years of investigation, the hundreds of convictions, the hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements, or the fundamental reforms that would follow. All he knew was that a driver appeared to be impaired and that his job required him to follow procedures regardless of who that driver turned out to be. In the end, that simple commitment to doing his job honestly made all the difference. It proved that individual integrity still matters, even within systems that have been compromised by those who believe themselves above accountability. And it demonstrated that justice, though sometimes delayed by corruption and obstruction, can eventually find those who have devoted their careers to evading it. Judge Harold Whitmore will spend the rest of his life in federal prison, stripped of the wealth and status he accumulated through decades of corruption. The victims of his crimes have received compensation that can never truly restore what was taken from them, but at least acknowledges the wrong that was done. And Deputy Daniel Reeves continues serving his community with the same quiet integrity that exposed the scandal in the first place, knowing that sometimes the most important thing any of us can do is simply refuse to look the other way. This case stands as a reminder that the scales of justice, though they can be weighted by money and power and corruption, eventually find their balance. It reminds us that institutions are only as honest as the people who operate them, and that eternal vigilance is necessary to prevent the accumulation of unchecked power. Most of all, it reminds us that ordinary people doing the right thing, even at great personal risk, remain our best defense against those who would corrupt the systems we depend on for fairness and justice.